This presentation describes the background to the royal visit to Canada in 1939 and provides an insight into the very full programme of visits undertaken by King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. Near the end of October 1936, the Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King had been in London on his way back from the League of Nations meeting in Geneva. He met with his British counterpart Stanley Baldwin and with King Edward VIII's private secretary Alexander Harding in preparation for his meeting with the King. Edward's relationship with Mrs. Simpson, the American divorcee, was causing serious concern at this time. Mackenzie King and Harding agreed that just a couple of positive events might help divert the public's attention. It was at this point Mackenzie King suggested that, if the King could come out to Canada and other parts of the Empire, the people would completely forget the other. Edward was popular, having made very successful tours to Canada in 1919 and 1927. He also owned a ranch in Alberta. The news of the King's proposed visit was announced by the Prime Minister on 3rd November 1936. Edward VIII would visit Canada the following May, soon after his coronation. Edward was also the King of Canada. The news was amended a week later. The visit would not be earlier than 1938. However, the announcement by the British Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin on the 10th of December 1936 that King Edward VIII would abdicate brought the matter to an end. In September 1937, the new King, George VI, met with John Buchan at Buckingham Palace and informed him that he would visit Canada and the United States. It was announced that this visit would take place in 1939. War clouds were daily growing blacker over Europe, which, although threatening the very idea of such a plan, did introduce a new imperative, which the American president was keen to exploit. The British royal family on American soil would send a clear message that the two English-speaking nations were in harmony. Such was the concern in Britain over the deteriorating international situation during the spring of 1939 that the Admiralty was not prepared to sanction deploying the battlecruiser HMS Repulse out of home waters. She was to have acted as a royal yacht for this voyage and instead was replaced by the Canadian Pacific liner RMS Empress of Australia. At the wish of the King, conscious of the disappointment felt in the Repulse, who had been heavily involved in all the preparations, the battlecruiser was allowed to remain in the Royal Squadron for the first leg of the journey westwards. No stranger to royal tours, the Empress of Australia had carried HRH, the Prince of Wales, to Canada 10 years earlier. She was to be escorted this time by two ships of the 2nd Cruiser Squadron Home Fleet. Whilst the two cruisers were alongside in Portsmouth prior to the Royal Squadron's departure on 6th of May 1939, truckloads of gold bullion from the Bank of England were covertly loaded aboard. The cruisers' working parties found the cases remarkably heavy for their size and may have guessed at their content that were bound for the vaults of Fort Knox and safety from the coming war in Europe. The secret cargo of more than 3,500 gold bars, worth more than £30 million in 1939, was to be used to pay for the looming World War. Another highly valuable crate was loaded aboard one of the two cruisers, one of the 4 precious original versions of the Magna Carta, this one from Lincoln Cathedral, which was first bound for the New York's World Fair, at where it was to take pride of place. During his visit to Canada, the King would have to make some speeches. John Buchan, now Lord Tweedsmuir, offered his services and at the same time gave specific recommendations as to the number, 4, and length, very short, conscious of the King's speech impediment. 4 were agreed upon, 1 on His Majesty's arrival in English and French, another in Ottawa during the dedication of the National War Memorial, a third in Vancouver or Victoria, and a farewell speech at Halifax. Tweedsmuir sent drafts of his speeches to the Prime Minister Mackenzie King for his comment, noting that the primary law of our Constitution is that the King's words must be the words of his Prime Minister. On the 17th of May, the royal couple arrived in Quebec Harbour, where they were met by Mackenzie King. On their approach to Canada, fog and ice shields caused a delay, forcing the cancellation of a large government dinner and an afternoon tea at Spencerwood, the residence of the Quebec Lieutenant Governor. More than 250,000 people crammed into the Plains of Abraham and along the heights overlooking the St. Lawrence to greet the ocean liner and for a glimpse of their King and Queen. The crowds roared "Vive le Roi" and "Vive la Reine" as the King and Queen alit on Canadian soil for the first time at Wolfe's Cove. The receptions at Quebec City, Trois-Rivières and Montreal were positive beyond expectations, and the King impressed Quebecers when he responded in French to the welcoming remarks. A new Golden Book for distinguished visitors was started in Montreal on May the 18th, when King George VI and Queen Elizabeth visited the City Hall. Here we see King George autographing the book as his Queen and Mayor Hood of Montreal look on. Their Majesties stand with Mayor Chameleon Hood on the steps of Montreal City Hall before continuing their tour of the city. There was a marathon motorcade through the city, and everywhere along the route there were crowds of people deliriously cheering their hearts out, some too deliriously. When the King and Queen stepped out onto the balcony at City Hall, the excitement was such that at least 10 women fainted, and this is according to the Montreal Gazette. On the 19th of May, the luxurious blue and white train, its 12 cars each equipped with a telephone and radio, pulled into Ottawa's Island Park station at about 11 o'clock in the morning. Despite the cold and clement weather, drizzle and what suspiciously looked like snow, tens of thousands had assembled to greet the King and Queen. Many had gone early, either to the train station or to find a viewing spot along the processional route. Descending from the train onto a red carpeted platform under a canopy draped with bunting, King George and Queen Elizabeth were met by Lord and Lady Tweedsmuir, Prime Minister Mackenzie King, members of Cabinet who were not present at Quebec City, and Ottawa's Mayor, Stanley Lewis. The King's first act was to inspect the Guard of Honour. With the clouds parting, the royal party, accompanied by an escort of the 4th Princess Louise's Dragoon Guards, rode in an open landau from the Island Park station to Rideau Hall, the home of the Governor-General. Along the route, the royal couple was greeted by a continuous rolling applause from the hundreds of thousands that lined the 8-mile route. With the King now resident in Canada, the Governor-General, as the King's representative in Canada, was essentially out of a job, exactly what Lord Tweedsmuir wanted to achieve with the royal visit. According to Gustave Langto, the official historian of the tour, when their Majesties walked into their Canadian residence, Rideau Hall, the Statute of Westminster had assumed full reality. The King of Canada had come home. Later that afternoon in the Senate, after another procession through the streets of Ottawa to Parliament Hill, the King gave royal assent to 9 bills. Again, this typically would have been the job of the Governor-General. On 21st of May, after dedicating the National War Memorial, the royal couple, instead of returning to their motorcade immediately afterward, spent half an hour mingling with the 25,000 First World War veterans who were part of a crowd of at least 100,000 people. It was a stunning gesture, especially in an age when royalty were only known as distant figureheads. John Buchan, who was also there, recognised the lasting impact of the walkabout on the eve of the Second World War. One old fellow said to me, "Aye man, if Hitler could just see this." It was wonderful proof of what a people's king means. That evening a state dinner was held at the Chateau Laurier Hotel for more than 700 guests. While a formal affair, the meal was held in an atmosphere of democratic ease. In the photograph we could see King George talking to Prime Minister Mackenzie King and Queen Elizabeth to John Buchan. After dinner the King and Queen stepped out onto the balcony of the hotel to receive thunderous applause from the 40,000 people in the square below. The couple travelled to Toronto on 22nd May, where Queen Elizabeth, as Colonel-in-Chief of the Toronto Scottish Regiment, presented new colours to the unit on the back campus of the university. This was followed by a lunch, attended by 500 guests, and afterwards the royal couple were met with cheers from 12,000 gathered admirers. Then they attended the King's Plate horse race and dedicated the newly named Coronation Park. Beyond Toronto, the westbound journey included stops in Winnipeg, Regina, Calgary, Banff, Vancouver and Victoria, as well as numerous small towns and villages. The train then travelled east, stopping among other places in Jasper, Edmonton, Saskatoon, Sudbury, Guelph, Kitchener, Windsor, Hamilton, St. Catharines and Niagara Falls, where the royal couple dedicated the soon-to-be-completed Rainbow Bridge. The locomotive was the Canadian Pacific Railway H1D class Royal Hudson, number 2850, built in Montreal Locomotive Works in 1938, and it pulled the Royal Train across Canada in 1939 and received royal designation from King George VI. For fans of Thomas the Tank, the train called Vinnie was based on that locomotive. In the midst of their tour, the royal couple spent 4 days in the United States, which included a visit with American President Franklin D. Roosevelt at his private residence Hyde Park and in Washington, D.C. The royal couple also visited the British and Canadian pavilions at the 1939 New York World's Fair and enjoyed a picnic lunch of hot dogs with the Roosevelts. The King and Queen developed a strong rapport with Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, which lasted throughout the Second World War. Queen Elizabeth recalled decades later that the American visit was very valuable because the King was able to talk to Roosevelt. Endless night talks they had because Hitler was looming then. After their visit to the United States, the royal couple returned to Canada and continued their tour through Rivière-du-Loup, Fredericton, St. John, Moncton and Charlottetown, and boarded the RMS Empress of Britain to return to the United Kingdom from Halifax. Of their departure, Mackenzie King wrote in his diary, "The Empress of Britain ran past one end of the harbour where she was towed around, then came back the opposite way to pull out to sea. She was accompanied by British warships and her own destroyers. The Bluenose and other vessels also in the harbour acted as a sort of escort. The King and Queen were at the very top of the ship and kept waving. No farewell could have been finer." Before returning to Britain, the royal couple sailed to St. John's, capital of the separate Dominion of Newfoundland at the time. After the trip, the King wrote to John Buchan, "I can tell you that our tour has done me untold good in every way. I was longing to see Canada, its people, its scenery, its possibilities, and I was not disappointed. I was thrilled by it all, and its climate has made me a new person. I've come back with a renewed vigour to all the problems which beset this old world of ours. I feel that I have had a rest, despite the very arduous programme we undertook to do, as everyone in Canada made our visit such an enjoyable one. I cannot thank you enough for all the help you gave me with my speeches, which I am sure struck the right note, and I was able to carry it on in my Guildhall speech, which was a great ordeal. And a copy of this full letter can be read in the museum.